So today we're going to start exploring our last theme of this church year, humanism. And humanism is probably one of the most important things that we could talk about as this church community. Humanism has a significant and intrinsic connection with Unitarian Universalism, which we'll explore today and next week, and then again on May 31st. About 40 to 45% of Unitarian Universalists nationally identify as humanists, and I think that that percentage is probably significantly higher here at All Souls. One thing that several of you might know, but maybe not all of you, is that 2 of the original 36 signers of the first Humanist Manifesto were ministers here at All Souls. And those 2 ministers alone served a tenure that spanned over 50% of our entire congregational life. So when we think about our connection, All Souls' connection with Unitarian Universalism, we could understand how interwoven this would be in this place. And not just because of Reverend Dr. Wicks and Baucus, those 2 signers, but also continuing on in our history. When the Reverend Dr. Paul Beatty was minister here, he was one of the presidents of the American Humanist Association, and he set a vision of All Souls. And his vision for All Souls was for us to be the humanist cathedral of the Midwest. It was an ambitious goal and one that we largely achieved. So as we work and think about setting our vision for our church, I just want to let you guys know that we should be humble in our character, but we need not be modest in our aspirations. We've learned that we could reach high and get to those places before. But fundamentally, what is humanism, and what are we talking about this month? Humanism, in its most general sense, is an approach that centralizes and celebrates human experience and human capabilities in the meaning-making process. That's a kind of formal way of saying there's a whole lot in this universe that we don't know, and even more things we don't even know we don't know. But we could be pretty certain that we can know some things. And instead of focusing on all those things we can't possibly grasp, let us turn our attention to those things that we can understand and touch and make meaning from. Those moments in our lives, the capacity of the human spirit, our ingenuity of mind, our capability of our hands and hearts. It's in many ways a very practical and common sense, and I think an intuitively a very affirming and sensible and approachable path. But the humanism that we are going to be talking a little bit more about today and this month is about the humanism that swept into the American religious landscape over the last 99 years. If we had to put a birth date on American humanism, it would have started in 1917 when Curtis Reese and John Dietrich got together at a little cluster meeting of the Western Unitarian Conference in Des Moines, Iowa. Des Moines is in Iowa, right? Okay. Of all the things I fact-checked. And there in that conversation, Curtis Reese shared a sermon that he had preached a year earlier in his congregation, and John Dietrich and him started to share ideas of what would fundamentally become humanism and eventually take the form within the Humanist Manifesto of 1933. So over those 16 years that humanism was developing between that first meeting and the Humanist Manifesto, there was a context that was shaping the ideas of John Dietrich and Curtis Reese and the other formers and signers of the Humanist Manifesto. So I want to talk a little bit about this context today because we know nothing is born in a vacuum. The first few of these contexts had been long in the making. The first one was the rise of science as a shaping force in our human understanding. It started when that apple fell on Newton's head, bonk! And he discovered, that seems to happen a lot when I sit under apple trees. The apples don't go flying up, they always seem to come falling down. There must be some natural law governing our world. And that sparked a whole group of other scientists throughout the generations continuing to search for these natural laws that shape our world. One of these scientists was, of course, Charles Darwin, who, by the way, attended a Unitarian church in England before he set sail. And of course, we know what Charles Darwin discovered, the theory of... You guys went to elementary school. Good job. The theory of evolution, which talks about the unfolding progression of life, both in the universe, but specifically of animal life and life here on our planet and plant life here on our planet. That it evolves from one form to another form in an ongoing process. These two revolutionary sparks of scientific process, of the scientific method and evolution changed Western culture and our global culture profoundly and forevermore. The humanists took a specific interpretation of what these discoveries meant. So liberal Christians took this information and said, they modified some of the traditional teachings and made room for the theories in ways that still affirmed theism. So they would say, we understand that there is an unfolding pattern of life, and that unfolding existence is a manifest God. God is existence. They'd also say, there is order in nature, there are rules, there's harmony, there is structure. That is a sign of a divinely blessed world. Humanists, in contrast, would say, and did say, it seems that there is a process of life unfolding. And it seems that there are laws. But we have no sense that these are blessed or holy or sacred. There's no sense that there is something that put that into place. If there was a great Big Bang, we don't know, and we're not always curious what happened before that Big Bang. There's a nuance there and a contrast there about what it affirms and where its curiosity is oriented towards. The second big change that had started in the early 1800s was the rise of biblical criticism, particularly higher biblical criticism. And as the century of the 19th century unfolded and we moved into the 20th century, we began to see a greater and greater willingness of Scripture being placed on the same level and approached the same way as historical documents. Now, when they started to examine the Bible for historical accuracy and consistency and verifiable evidence, they ran into a few stumbling blocks. Maybe more than a few. Liberal Christianity said, now we understand why these scriptures are holy in a new way. They are a text of our ancestors, written in a historical context. They are a faith response to turbulent times. And the authors of these texts, inspired by God, wrote these texts using myth and metaphor and a lot of literary leniency to create these texts of meaning, which are wisdom handed down to us. Others, and some humanists used to say, what this shows is that this lacks verifiable truth. That a lot of the beliefs that we have been taught cannot be verified by this text anymore. And so out went some of the theologies that had undergirded the Christian religious experience. Those went out with biblical authority. So goodbye to the virgin birth, goodbye through salvation through Jesus, goodbye to universal damnation, goodbye to the process of atonement. And instead, the scriptures were looked upon often as a stumbling block instead of an aid in the exploration of religion. Moving a little bit more into the 20th century, at least two other significant things happened. One was World War I. But going into World War I, liberal Christianity was on the rise. There was a period called the social gospel movement when the mainline Christian churches said, there is progress everywhere. Humans are discovering and creating greater possibilities and greater access, and we're moving towards greater equality. And so they began to institute a lot of movements and institutions to try to bring about greater equality. Boys and girls clubs, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, various different YMCAs, and all sorts of different movements to try to pull up people into a greater fellowship of equality. Going into World War I, that notion of progress and fellowship and ease and harmony was shattered. As Americans came together to support the war effort, and as they survived the influenza virus that wreaked havoc through our population, we became a little bit more of an in-group who supported and affirmed similar thinking, who all got on board and kind of went with the flow. And you began to see, coming out of World War II, amongst mainstream culture, less tolerance for dissonance. Resident aliens were targeted and shipped across our borders. Unions were cracked down upon. Suffragists were defamed. At the same time, you began to see our economy boom. The Roaring '20s, with its parties and its celebrations and its luxuriousness, was a sharp contrast to the war years. And so while some were living high, there was a creative but lost generation who felt in their own experiences, in their own hearts, that death and indulgence lay too close together. They began to feel despair and disgust and despair. This sense of purposelessness and futility and loss was another keen point that humanists were responding to. There was a movement of utilitarianism, which said essentially that we have no sense that the world isn't hostile to humanity. We have no evidence that the world is here for our purpose or meaning making, or that our lives matter at all. And so in these years of 1917 to 1933, humanism purposely walked this middle path. It was a path between liberal religion and utilitarianism. They said, we will forego our use of traditional notions of religion, we will abandon God language, but we will also not move into a vacant, nihilistic materialism. In response to Freud and the emergence of psychology, which Freud really shook things up, he really presented at first in their minds this idea of humanity subjected to irrational will and uncontrollable impulses. And instead, humanists said, no, we have a thinking mind and a strong will that we can forge ahead, not only for us, but also with a great democratic sense that we will apply to religion, to theology, to economics, and to politics. It was the democratic way that pulled people together. It was the middle way, forging a new way for Americans to move together. And it's unsurprising that between these two options, that this middle way garnered a lot of attraction and many adherents. Its populations rose and rose and rose until their accumulation in 1933 in the general populace. So here we are, nearly a century later. There are about 250,000 Unitarian Universalists who identify as humanists, and about 10% of those, and about 10% of that number, about 25,000 who identify as humanists outside of our congregational walls. My question is it time for a renewed and revived humanism that's shaped by and related to our context today? This question about what a revitalized humanism for the 21st century might look like is really the topic of inquiry for this month. I think it's good for us to recognize how that ground, that context has shifted. The Newtonian physics still provides undergirded meaning, but there's a whole bunch of other scientific discoveries of quantum theories and other physics that have shaken up and dislodged some notions of Newtonian physics that make the world seem less stable and less coherent than it once did. We have as well the growing awareness that utilitarianism, instead of diminishing, is actually on the rise. With each generation, you could track in surveys of Americans that each generation feels less of a sense of transcendence. They don't believe that the future will rise above anything that they're noticing at this instance in their lives. Fewer people are going to church and experiencing the social connection and bonds that have often helped us work together for greater good. There is a rise in consumerism and materialism, and there is a growing frustration that humanity is merely a cog in the wheel of consumerism. At the same time, religion has flourished, but not the religion of liberal mainline Christianity that the humanists were responding to. Instead, the religion that's on the rise globally is a fundamentalist religion, not just in Christianity, but in Islam and other religions as well. That's literalist, fundamentalist, black and white in its thinking, and tolerance is on the decline. Liberal Christianity has empty churches. So on the one hand, our path is between this fundamentalist, ideological religion globally and meaninglessness and hopelessness on the other side. My spiritual companions who are with me on this journey every day. Will we walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, offering an alternative between blind relief and nihilism? Will we help salvage the religious sympathies and an ethical framework from the possibility of loss and disassociation all around? Finding this middle way is our task. And I know with gratitude and courage and love and humility, we will take up this work together. Thank you for all that you do. Blessed be, and amen.